Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to the Middle East, shall we, today? And it's not a fun place to be, but it's certainly a place that we ought to go. And I have two friends here who are experts on Middle Eastern politics. Stephen Zunes is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco, and he specializes in the politics of the Middle East. Jennifer Bing has been working with the American Friends Service Committee since 1989, and her job is to organize speaking tours, conferences, educational workshops, protests, and other such public events. Again, especially on Israel and Palestine. So these people think about the Gaza situation day and night. I think nowadays, even a few of the rest of us who've been cautious about even addressing that issue are thinking about Gaza constantly now. So I want to, I don't know where to start. I'm going to ask Stephen, I think, if you will just give us your analysis of where the situation stands now, and then Jennifer can, it'll be interesting if she agrees with you or not. So what's your take on what's going on, Stephen?
Well, what we're seeing in Gaza indeed meets the international legal definition of genocide. That Israel's targeting the population as a whole. They are targeting journalists. They're targeting healthcare workers. They're targeting first responders. They're massacring people in line for food. They are denying food, water, and adequate food, water, and medical supplies to the region. And they've been quite explicit that, along with Donald Trump, they want to ethnically cleanse the enclave and establish this Mediterranean resort. Meanwhile, in the occupied West Bank, the settlements are expanding. These settler militia, they're comparable to the infamous death squads of El Salvador in the 80s, are killing people, including prominent nonviolent activists. And they are all doing this with a blank check from the United States, unconditional military aid, the successive U.S. vetoes of UN Security Council resolutions trying to stop the killing, but on the other hand, we are seeing the international community, global civil society, mobilizing to an enormous degree. A lot of people, especially younger people, are recognizing the seriousness of the situation and the wrongness of Western support for Israel, and even older peace activists, older generation people who, as you mentioned, were maybe a little reticent to address Israel-Palestine before, are now recognizing the moral imperative. So there is a real shift going on. And even within the Democratic Party, the Democratic leadership still supports what Israel's doing, but there's a growing dissent within the party ranks. So we are starting to see a shift. The question, though, is how long will it take? How many more people will die until this popular mobilization will actually lead to changes in policy? Because ultimately,
just before you came, I'd been speculating with Jennifer about what the graph would look like. I want to know the trajectory of public opinion on this, especially in the U.S., but certainly globally as well. Because I remember about 30 years ago, I believe I read an article in a magazine, like Harper's or Atlantic or something, saying something like, it might be that somehow some of the policies that Israel is taking might not be quite justifiable. Is it possible that a wonderful country like Israel could be taking a policy position that isn't quite right? That was the first shocking admission that maybe there might be something questionable there. And obviously, the baseline was that, the vast majority of Americans, or the people that, the readers of this article, would assume that, of course, Israel is always right no matter what. But somehow now that that is not as obvious to people as it was. And I was asking Jennifer how she's been in the business a long time, looking at this issue, how what that if you were drawing a graph. I guess I thought it would be flat, 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 no change, no change. And then suddenly in the last year or even less, a big change in public opinion. But that's just, my weird guess without any basis. Tell me what, if you were drawing that graph, what it would look like.
Well, Jennifer and I are fairly unusual in that we have been working on this for most of our adult lives, and we're even more unusual in that our parents were very much involved in this issue at a time when the liberal consensus was very much pro-Israel.
Yeah.
And so we have seen, this shift over the decades, and and it has been gradual, as the Israeli governments become more right wing and repressive, and when the Palestine Liberation Organization and Fatah renounced terrorism and open to a two-state solution and that sort of thing. So there had been a shift, but it has definitely been more dramatic in the past year and a half or so, when it was very clear that Israel's response to the terrorist attacks of October 2023 were not simply to go after terrorists, but indeed were after the population as a whole. Another thing that's worth emphasizing is the striking difference generationally. Outside of maybe LGBTQ issues, there's no political issue where age and political attitude is such a straight line that the older you are, you tend to be more pro-Israel. The younger you are, you tend to be pro-Palestinian or at least pro-peace.
Not me. I'm going to be 94 tomorrow.
Yeah, so you remember the kind of romantic, idealistic view of Israel, Paul Newman in Exodus, the plucky kibbutzniks fighting off the savages, almost in a cowboy Indian, kind of thing. That was the dominant paradigm. Israel back then was the darling of the liberal establishment. Today, it's the darling of the Christian right. Our generation saw Zionism as a national liberation movement of oppressed people. This younger generation, conscious about racism and indigenous rights, see it as colonial settlerism. They see it as an apartheid kind of system, which, by most legal definitions, it is. And there are. A number of reasons that there is this large generational shift. So again, I'd say there had been a gradual increase in being willing to critique Israel in the West, but it has definitely become much more dramatic.
Well, now Jennifer said 2 years, the last couple of years. Is that? Do you want to expand on that, Jennifer? Is that your analysis about when things begin to look substantially different? At least to young people.
Well, in terms of young people, I think it probably started closer to 2005, 2006, actually. I think the last 20 years. And I think that was in response to the BDS call, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions from Palestinian civil society, that started to ask people externally to look at the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa as a model for how to do organizing and how to refocus the conversation on Palestinian rights, and looking at, the rights of refugees, the rights of citizenship, all the human rights and that sort of thing. And so I think the student movement, if you look over the last 20 years, there's been this gradual learning of, like, learning more about Palestine, listening to Palestinian voices, having access to media in a way that was different than when Stephen and I started doing this work. There were 3 networks and there wasn't even CNN when we first started our organizing, whereas now, and even in the last couple of decades, the access to people's voices on the ground, so that you see, when a Palestinian nonviolent activist is killed in Masafer Yatta, you see the footage like that day, and people can mobilize and see for themselves the realities on the ground. Whereas before, there was a lot of like needing to read books or needing to find the very few films that were made, and always with the countering propaganda from the dominant, narrative about, this is manufactured or lies or whatever, the defamation of Palestinian voices and experiences, which has been decades in the making. So I think students, so I think that there's been movement on campuses, and then when we saw like student encampments, and Columbia University is a kind of poster child of that, but others as well. That didn't just come out of the blue. That really actually has been slowly growing over time. But I do think in general, what my reference to like these last 2 years have just totally flipped the conversation about Gaza in particular. I think that is because of the horrific live stream genocide that we've watched. Because before that, talking about Gaza and the blockade, and we always remind people, like, October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. There were conditions on the ground that led to that break, and
well, I have to say that my reaction when I heard it was, well, what did they expect? Now that's pretty rough, but that's my first thought was, you're surprised?
You treat people like animals. You keep them encaged. You prevent any sort of aspiration, hopes for young people to have a different life, and for the world to not respond when there is nonviolent protests at the fence. When in 2018 people were shot for protesting nonviolently and shot and killed. And then the world just did nothing. The international systems didn't step in and say, no, this blockade needs to end. You can't keep people encaged like this. So yeah, it's I echo your feeling, Meta. I mean, it still was horrific, but somewhat understandable.
Well, let's talk about what has happened lately in terms of geopolitics. Some nation state action has happened. Canada, for example, has said that they're, with some conditions, that they will recognize Palestine, I think at the UN General Assembly, which should be coming up soon. And other countries have, of course, done so long before. But that's a break for Canada. And of course, there's something has happened in the ICJ in terms of, I think that's the thing we should talk about. How much impact can the ICJ decision have on general public opinion and the political impact? I mean, so that politicians actually have to think about how they're going to vote. Stephen.
Well, there have been 2 decisions by the International Court of Justice of significance. One is around the illegality of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And that international law allows for countries to temporarily hold land for security reasons of other nations, but not to hold on to it permanently, not to colonize it, not to restrict basic rights of economic, educational, cultural, etc. of the population, things that Israel's been violating since they seized the territory in 1967. The UN Security Council at that time voted a resolution that called for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories in return for security guarantees from its Arab neighbors, which they've long received. I mean, their most important neighbors, Jordan and Egypt, have formal diplomatic relations and non-aggression pacts, and the other Arab states have all said that they're willing to recognize Israel and have security guarantees in return for the end of the occupation, land for peace, just like the resolution said. The International Court of Justice ruled that the continued occupation is indeed illegal. Of course, the Biden administration denounced that. Mm-hmm. They're also looking at the question of whether Israel is indeed committing genocide, and that has their preliminary ruling seemed to appear that they were, and that the final judgments will be coming out sometime in the next few months. And of course, this was roundly denounced by the United States. But of course, the United States pulled out of the ICJ, back in the 1980s when it ruled against U.S. attacks on Sandinista Nicaragua, and indeed, it's one of a number of international legal institutions that the United States actually played a major role in founding, but have basically rejected when they challenge U.S. prerogatives or the or that of our allies. But even though the World Court does not have enforcement mechanisms on its own, having this legal foundation is important in terms of global public opinion and what some of the governments, particularly European governments and countries like Canada, which do like to think themselves, middle powers that do like to see themselves as recognizing the importance of international law, that it can be a means of moving their policies forward. Now, it's good to see that Canada is willing to recognize the state of Palestine, as nearly 3/4 of the world's countries have already done, though the conditions seem a little odd. I mean, you have a right to exist or you don't. Shouldn't depend on what the other party does or doesn't do, But because my impression, Canada said, "Well, we'll recognize you if Israel doesn't stop the siege." But Palestine has a right to exist. Period. And the U.S. position and that of a number of other Western countries is that well. It was great. It was fine for the UN to create Israel without the permission of the Palestinians or other Arab states, but for Palestine to exist, you have to get the permission of Israel. And for example, the Democratic Platform says we support a two-state solution, but only through bilateral negotiations. Which, given that Israel has categorically ruled that out altogether, saying it can only be through bilateral negotiations means they don't really support a two-state solution. They're just saying that because that's a way of sounding like their objective when they indeed have no intention of pressuring Israel to make a two-state solution possible.
Last week, there was an interesting debate here in Canada, which I didn't sit in on or didn't watch, but I've received the text from it. And it was an extremely interesting way of formulating the question. It was something about should the UN revoke I could actually find the exact wording, but it'd take me a minute. I'm trying to recollect more or less what it was. Should the UN revoke resolution number something, which is what what had been taken that established the two-state solution as the goal for way back in the 40s or whenever.
Without the 181 passed in November of 1947.
Mm-hmm. Establish it. And one guy, a rabbi, I think, argued, yes, it should be revoked. And of course, then the question would, what would that do? The other guy, Robin Collins, said, well, he agreed that it shouldn't have happened. It was a bad idea. It was a wrong decision. But at this point, it's hard to see how you could revoke it without causing, complete chaos. And so he said, no, we have to stick with that two-state solution as the only only one that has been ratified as generally in public opinion and international law as the legitimate goal for the region. Comment on that, please.
Just briefly, I mean, I think the concern right now is even among people who don't consider themselves ideologically anti-Zionist, there is a growing recognition that Israeli colonization of the West Bank has been so comprehensive that the settlements surround all these Arab population centers. The idea of a contiguous Palestinian state may be impossible at this point. Now, I held out for a two-state solution a lot longer than most of the people I work with, but my last trip, which was to the West Bank, which was like 8 or 10 years ago, I realized, hey, this is unrealistic. Now, I suppose one could think of a confederated system where the settlers could stay, but they would be under Palestinian law, or and there are a number of sort of combination things, some hybrids of one state, two state people are talking about, which is worth considering. It need not necessarily be a democratic secular state, but the classic kind of two state solution, as was people were talking about like in the 1990s and that kind of thing. It really does seem too late for that.
Jennifer, do you agree with him?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the analysis about the two-state solution and the conversations about it. I found it to be more impactful to think about what are our goals and principles for Israelis and Palestinians to be able to live together and with dignity and rights, and how do we get to a place that could ensure that. And I think at this point we are at trying to stop the harm. And I think looking at the anti-apartheid struggle and recognizing that Israel is an apartheid state, and what needs to change those systems, because if those systems don't, if the systems of privileging people based on their religion continues to exist, you're not going to have a place where people can live in peace.
Okay, now, if I'm not mistaken, what Stephen was referring to immediately was that creating a contiguous state between these two pieces, putting them back together, is not realistic.
I was just there in January, and you couldn't. There's so many new checkpoints, so many new blockages, and of course, if there's the political will to move the blockages and that sort of thing, that's one thing. But the level of violence and aggression that we see by Israeli settlers, particularly under this current Israeli administration, is just out of control. I mean, there are absolute no protections for any Palestinians anywhere. So that when people see, settlers attacked this village and burned cars and shot at kids and army raids, 10,000 Palestinians have been put in prison in the last 2 years with no due process, nothing that would suggest any kind of real rule of law. When we see these conditions happening in the West Bank, and then compounding that with what we see in Gaza of, just genocide, it's hard to imagine, like, how do we get to that place of actually people wanting to live side by side next to each other? And, I think that people who supported the two-state solution, people like Peter Beinart, for instance, a prominent Jewish commentator in the U.S., who was a big proponent of the two-state solution, also has seen like what we have created here has made that impossible.
How would you solve the problem if you could write constitutions for everybody and they would obey you?
Well, I'll let the political scientists take that question
Well,
first. But I do have opinions.
Go ahead, please,
But
Jennifer.
yeah, no, I mean, I don't know what the magic, scenario is.
But you've got to come up with an alternative. If
Okay.
you're going to say, I give up on this, then what else have you got?
Okay. I mean, Meta, I think first of all, I think that I tend to try to avoid these questions simply because the urgent thing right now is to stop the genocide, stop the slaughter.
Yeah.
And I also think for both legal and political reasons, it is important to distinguish between Israel within its recognized international borders and the occupied territories. The United States is increasingly not, acting like it's all Israel, and that's very, very dangerous in terms of international law. I mean, it's the same thing we're talking about with Russia and Ukraine and Morocco and Western Sahara territory. Countries cannot expand their territory by force. I mean, that's a fundamental principle enshrined in the UN Charter. So I think talking about stopping the settlements, the violence in the West Bank, the genocide in Gaza, and that's really crucial. But I think the key thing is to stress equality. Whether it be a two-state solution, a confederal system, or a democratic secular state or binational state. I mean, the one that again has to be on equality of both peoples and the guaranteed rights of whoever the minority is. That is a critical virtue, a critical thing. And it's not, on one hand, it doesn't seem as utopian as it might sound. If you look at American public opinion, it shows that the majority of Americans support a two-state solution. But if you ask them, if a two-state solution is impossible, do you support basically Israel controlling the whole thing with Jewish supremacy, which is essentially the system they have now, or one democratic secular state with equal rights? The vast majority of Americans support the latter. But U.S. policy is currently, giving, at least among the Democrats, give lip service for a two-state solution while in practice supporting Jewish supremacy, or the Republicans who quite overtly support Jewish supremacy.
Right.
And the slogan, "Free Palestine from the river to the sea," people are saying, oh, that means you want to kill or expel all the Jewish Israelis. But in fact, that term, "Free Palestine, river to the sea," originally came from left-leaning secular Palestinian nationalists in the 60s, which were talking about a democratic, secular state. That this is an idea that's been around, for quite a while now. I would like, personally, when people chant that, I'd rather hear them say, "From the river to the sea, we demand equality," or something like that. That shows that doesn't unnecessarily trigger people who assume the worst, from that slogan. I mean, Hamas ended up appropriating that slogan 6 or 7 years ago. So people say, "Oh, it's a Hamas slogan," but Slavic Ukraine was used by fascists, but that doesn't mean we don't support a free Ukraine. But my point being is that the details, frankly, are less important than the underlying principle of equal rights, and that is so fundamental.
Well, all right. Now you've made some step in the direction of saying, what else have you got? Mm-hmm. And when you ask what the American public opinion says, and the majority of them want something other than everything being controlled by Israel, then elaborate on what that second option entails. I mean, okay, you don't have to write a constitution for me now, but what would that involve?
It would mean either just a simple, one person, one vote with equal rights of everybody, in historic Palestine, which includes Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, with presumably the right of return of both Palestinian refugees and Jews from anywhere in the world who still want to see Israel as their homeland. It could also be, again, with guaranteed equal rights for both. It could also be a situation where, a Bosnia-type situation, which isn't ideal, but at least it stops people from killing each other, where you have, legislatures for both ethnic groups and a joint presidency, and, where one can't, dominate the other. There's part of the confederal kind of system or cantonal system like they have in Switzerland. I mean, there are a number of options out there, but again, the status quo is totally unacceptable, and it needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the profiteering.
Do you back him on all of that, Jennifer? Or do you have?
Yeah, I agree. And I think a key element is that there are a lot of people that are profiting on this ongoing violence and keeping the status quo, and that needs to change as well. So we have to expose all the things that are blocking that possibility, that people whether it's governments who, that seems obvious, that aren't doing the right thing, but it's also military contractors who are making so much money off of the carnage in Gaza.
What I'm hearing is that Stephen is saying it would be one state. I don't know whether you'd call it Israel, Palestine, or some hyphenated version, but all citizens in both territories would be part of one country. They would each have all voting rights, etc. So in effect, that gives away the one thing that has been most important in the whole debate to Jews, is you don't have a Jewish homeland that is guaranteed specifically as a right to any Jew in the world who wants to go there.
Supremacy of rights.
Am I understanding what you're saying, Stephen?
I recognize the importance for historical and religious and very practical reasons that Israel exists. But at the time Israel was created, indeed the time of the original Zionist movement, nationalism, the nation state, was the way where you protected one's identity and security, could be protected. Now, the early Zionists were quite clear that they were colonizing this territory. I mean, when they say Zionism racist? Yes, but Jewish nationalism, Zionism was racist, but so was British nationalism, so was French nationalism, so was German nationalism, so was Dutch. This is the age of nationalism, the late 19th, early 20th century. But these other nationalisms at least gave up most of their colonies finally, and have created more pluralistic societies. Israel has not. Now, in terms of some of the early calls of the Palestine Liberation Organization was they had to dismantle Zionist institutions. I don't think that's necessary. I think you can definitely have. The Jews have lived there for generations now. They have their own distinct national identity and language. They're not going to go back to Poland or or whatever. But so I recognize it, but so a democratic secular state or a binational state, would certainly want to guarantee people's unique identities as Jews, that protect those rights, that a Jew anywhere around the world, if there's persecution springs up, that there's a place that they know they can go and immediately have refuge, and just as in Canada with its a strong sense of multiculturalism and even federal support for various ethnicities, having their cultural events and their other special kinds of things. I think certainly the Israel/Palestine, whatever you call it, should be available for Jews to maintain that. There should not be treated like Jews have been as minorities in other parts of the world, including Arab countries. There's obviously got to be some recognition of people's identity and rights. But what they can't continue to do is to say, if you're a non-Jew living in Israel, we have 100 laws that discriminate against you, and that only Jews are the true citizens of this country, much less the situation in the West Bank, where you really do have a more pure apartheid type situation. This has got to end.
Okay, now how far would the Jewish population of Israel today go along with that? I mean, my impression is that during a war, most people line up with the government and say, you know, my country right or wrong, and that's also partly true now that the citizens of Israel are not being as critical or not thinking at all along the lines that you've just been describing, and would not be favorable to that. Tell me I'm wrong.
I don't think you're wrong. I think that, the polls that even show a majority of support in Israel for the continued genocide against Palestinians in Gaza it's shocking. And I think asking any society, if you look at South Africa, nobody wants to give up privilege, but you do have to be persuasive about, what's in it for them. I don't think anyone in their right mind would say that if a Jewish person is seeking safety and that they should move to Israel. I mean, that's like the last safe place for Jews. So I don't. If you think about what is your dream, like what is it? If you can have a rational conversation about what draws you to a place, and if you have the ability to actually talk about how does one guarantee being able to live side by side with insecurity and recognizing rights, like there's tremendous amount of work to do. How are you going to tell a 6-year-old in Gaza who's had their family obliterated and lived through this terror in the last 2 years, like, oh, hey, how about living right next door to the Israelis who just, bombed your country to smithereens? Like, yes, there's going to be tremendous amount of work needed. And that's the role of peacemakers. Like, that's the role of outside people who are not so caught up in the situation on the ground. And that's where the failure of the international community on October 8th was so disappointing, is that it was a time where people who weren't directly impacted could have said, let's really deal with this issue. Let's sit down and have genuine negotiations and figure out what we need to convince all of our populations to change course. And that didn't happen. And it's a tragedy, but I think we can't lose hope that still is a possibility in the future.
I mean, if you look back at the time of the Camp of the Oslo Accords, Hamas had the support of maybe 10-15% of the population, and they put the Palestinians put the faith in Fatah and Arafat and the Palestine Authority, the PLO, who are saying, yeah, we'll have to give up our dream of liberating all of Palestine, but we could get the 22% of Palestine, which is Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And by using nonviolence, by using negotiations, by the United States being an honest broker, we will have this Palestinian state. And the refusal of the United States to be an honest broker, to allow Israel to expand the settlements and the like, and continued repression, not to mention the corruption of the Palestine Authority and other things, alienated it to the point that that Hamas had had support of close to 45% of the population, and through the plurality of the vote, they ended up getting the majority of the Palestinian parliament. Then when the Bush administration pushed Fatah to stage a coup, basically to throw them out of government, the Fatah still controlled the executive branch. Hamas got wind of it, try to counter coup, and when the dust cleared, they controlled Gaza, and the Palestine Authority controlled the urban enclaves and the West Bank. And it is just there's been repeated missteps, primarily by the United States, that has given the lesson that moderation doesn't work. Jennifer referred to the March for Return, nonviolent march along the border with Gaza and Israel, in which Israel massacred scores of unarmed protesters. The rise of Hamas, again, nothing justifies terrorism, nothing justifies the horror of October 7th, but it is a direct consequence of missteps by U.S. and Israeli leaders. And the whole idea is that if you don't, in order to stop extremists, you need to be able to reward the moderates. And the moderates were not rewarded. The moderates were denied, and thus you have this rise of the extremists.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now
and we've also rewarded the extremists in Israel.
Very much
like the amount of military aid and political cover, etc. Like you said, Matt, at the beginning of our conversation, people just wanted to assume the best about Israel. And, you have Congress, everyone giving Israel a pass, even on our own laws that say you shouldn't be selling weapons to a country that is committing human rights violations, blatant human rights violations. Well, what have we witnessed in the last 2 years but that? Those are U.S. bombs being dropped on apartment houses and hospitals and schools and killing journalists and so forth. So, the U.S. isn't even following its own laws and has emboldened these settlers and right-wing leaders in Israel.
Well, but at least the press really is covering the horrors. Every day you see.
Maybe your press, not so much here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's just been mixed. There's certainly more frank about some atrocities, but I have been disturbed that they will take seriously certain Israeli claims that are demonstrably false and the like. So we are getting more critical press coverage, but not nearly enough. We still have the same bias we've always had, whether it be Central America or initially Southeast Asia or places where there is a tendency to be a little more easy on pro-Western nations when it comes to human rights abuses than governments that we don't like.
Well, one of the things that Jennifer and I were talking about before you came, Stephen, was about the role of the press or the role of journalists. And I feel that, I said to her, and I think she agreed with me even, that a program such as this, where we're trying to explore reality, is not a place where you can do conflict resolution. It's not the right place, because that's where you try to find common ground. The important thing to be doing, and I think more and more, I do think the press is doing it more now, is to expose conflicts that maybe haven't been studied or recognized fully, and in a way pick fights rather than try to heal conflicts that are there, so that we can actually see what needs to be handled. And that's why I hope that's what we're doing today. In fact, I don't know whether you agree with that or not, but comment on that, and then I want to ask you about something else.
I would say one of the initiatives that's really taken off in British Columbia has been the growth of the apartheid-free movement, which is something that we have been a part of in the U.S., but there's now over 145 communities in British Columbia who've declared them to be themselves to commit to be an apartheid-free community, which means withdrawing their support for Israel's apartheid. Yeah. And in the same way that we had nuclear-free zones and communities having conversations at the local level has been so important, I think, to both combat the disinformation and to have actual conversations at the local level that were often suppressed before. And I agree with you. I think it's time to have the hard conversations. We saw last January in Burlington, Vermont, a 3-hour debate of the city council debating whether or not apartheid exists, Israel's an apartheid state or not, but also what it should be Americans' complicity or not complicity in allowing that to continue. And the fact that it ended up that like it was a tied vote and the mayor voted the wrong way, but they're coming back again this year to do it again. But the fact that there were 3 hours of conversation and debate, and yes, it gets heated and people were passionate about it, but that does move the needle. And I think you certainly see it in the Jewish community of like when you actually talk about what's happening and create spaces to sometimes they're confrontational, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's like talking to your neighbors one-on-one, where you start out with what do we agree on, what are the values that we both share, and then have a harder conversation about like, well, we both want to see people living with dignity and freedom. And so how do we get there? And exactly. one of the things is this bad stuff has to stop happening. And who's accountable to make that happen?
I think my guess is that the U.S. being the only real, in many votes, the U.S. votes with Israel and nobody else in no other country in the world.
The United States is very much an international outlier, and this is not just with Trump. We're international outlier in a lot of things with Trump, but even under Biden, we are like the only negative vote in otherwise unanimous UN Security Council resolution, simply calling for a ceasefire or even just a temporary pause in the fighting. And similarly, vetoing Palestinian membership in the United Nations, and even go to the General Assembly, 192 members. The United States is usually one of 9, voting on Israel's side. The others being these very dependent, tiny Pacific islands or a few far right governments, like Argentina or Hungary, it's just. It's extraordinary, how removed the United States is from the broad international consensus.
Well, now my notion is that if the U.S. flipped, I mean, we see changing opinion in the U.S. I don't know what the portions are now. I'd like to see, poll results. You probably know them. But if opinion really changed to supporting what you said, describing this one-state solution, I guess that's what you would call it, and we simply said we're not giving Israel any more weapons for this kind of thing, and so on. Wouldn't that do the whole thing? Wouldn't just the U.S. opinion and support make all the difference in the world, and they would have to capitulate and start really seriously working toward a solution?
Very much so. I mean, if you look, we've had Eisenhower and Carter and Reagan and the first President Bush and Obama have all forced Israel to stop military campaigns and or withdraw from recently conquered territory by simply threatening to withhold aid. The United States does have that power. Now, the going towards a binational or democratic secretary of state, that's going to be a long process. I don't think just a little pressure is going to do that, but we could certainly stop the war in Gaza. We could very possibly freeze the expansion of settlements, and along with European countries, perhaps using economic pressure, as we did with apartheid South Africa, lead towards towards a more realistic and more permanent peace. Because the thing is that Israel, while global Jewish opinion, particularly in the United States, I've noticed, has been moving increasingly to the left, increasingly critical of Israeli policies, in some cases even Zionism itself. Israel's been moving in the opposite direction. Israel's been moving to the right. Now, part of it is demographic because the very religious nationalist right wing families tend to have tend to have big families, and the more liberal secular Israelis tend to have smaller families. And it seems like a lot of their kids are immigrating to Berlin now, just to get out of the situation because it's so bad. But the other reason, frankly, is that they know they can get a blank check from the United States. If you look at Israeli elections, when the United States is put on pressure, people tend to vote left because there are consequences of the action. When the United States gives them a blank check, they move right because they know they can get away with stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So and again, the vast majority of white South Africans didn't want to end apartheid. They would have kept it forever if they could, but the pragmatic voices there, recognized that that they had to negotiate, and it was a direct result of the international sanctions. The armed struggle by the ANC never got anywhere. The resistance in townships were nonviolent resistance, civil resistance did have a major impact, but it was the international sanctions that were critical in getting South Africa to deal, and indeed forcing a majority of white South Africans to acquiesce to that.
Okay, now 2 weeks ago, I had a global town hall. We do them on the last Sunday of every month, and we did talk. Or we had another meeting, a different one, of members, where we talked about Gaza. And we actually talked about Gaza for the first time. People have avoided the topic, I think, in the past. But when I focused on it, said let's talk about what we can do, and I would say everybody wanted to come up with some good, helpful solution, and they did. But they're all very long-term solutions that involve changing, I don't know, changing history in a way, the things that would take 40, 50 years, if you're really lucky, to make a real difference so it wasn't about specific changes in governmental systems or aid relations or what to do about selling weapons or any of those practical political decisions. It was all things like how to do therapy with people who have been, and of course I think it's really true that a lot of the motivation for Israeli atrocities, if you will, come from the history of of the Holocaust and the survival of the tragedy and the trauma. So I think doing therapy is not a bad idea, but it certainly isn't going to help tomorrow in Gaza. Let's talk about what we can realistically ask people to do. I'll sign something, but honestly, nobody had a petition for me to sign. Tell me what you want me to do, folks, and I'll try.
Well, I think just having programs like this where people can discuss the issues is really important. You're one of the most outstanding peace educators in the world, and you've done incredible work. And this is obviously much of the work you do is quite relevant to what's going on here. But I think at this point, while all these things, longer term things, are important, and in conflict resolution, when you think of all these steps towards a positive peace, towards real actual resolution, the first element is stop the violence. That the very first thing is to to stop the
How
action.
do we do that? What?
And that is encouraging our governments to be willing to impose sanctions and other pressures to Israel to stop the genocide.
Yeah.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I would agree. Like the violence just has to stop, and there has to be pressure placed on Israel to comply with international law and human dignity and decency. I also think that it is important to talk to people, to Palestinians. Honestly, they're often like not part of the discourse. I edited a book that was published in 2022 called "Light in Gaza: Writings Born of Fire," and it was 12 Palestinian writers from Gaza talking about their lives in Gaza and what they kind of dream for the future and how they look at their particular field of expertise. One was an architect, another was a cultural worker, another was a teacher, like all different fields about what their lives were like. And, when the book came out, it was like people didn't even know where Gaza was, and they only thought of it as like, 70%. If they knew anything, they thought, 70% of the people are refugees and it's poor and depressed and all that. But they didn't know the history of Gaza. They didn't know how people lived there, how they flourished, how it was a center of creativity, and all the stereotypes about women being oppressed. All these things were undone by actually talking to people and reading and understanding their history. And I think that is what Palestinians are clinging onto at this point, just like the Jewish community after the Holocaust. Palestinians, indeed, in their view, they are living through their Holocaust right now, worse than 1948 in terms of facing annihilation, and they want so desperately to hold on to their cultural history, their rich cultural history, which, by the way, does include living side by side with Jews, even in Gaza. But we do have to reclaim that history. I think we need to know it. We need people to, because if we're going to think about the future in a different way, we also have to know the past and come to terms with what has been destroyed, but also what can be rebuilt. So that would be my other suggestion. In addition to, the political side of things, in our communities, we need to make sure that there are more books in our libraries that talk about Palestinians and their history. We need to have more, just more visibility of that, to just bring some balance into the view, because for so long those voices have been silenced.
Let me just ask the simple thing: how do you get food in there now? That is the urgent thing. People are getting shot just trying to get to the station with a pan to put some rice in it.
We have staff in Gaza, actually. I should have mentioned that earlier in our conversation. It just didn't come up. But we do have Palestinian staff who are still alive in Gaza. It's incredible that they've been there and able to work on the ground locally to provide food and water and other social supports. But part of what has happened, and our approach to relief, is to rely on what's available in Gaza, so that there are farmers who every 3 months, they still have some land. There still is ability to create food. But really, since March 2nd, that has been stopped. Like, even the trucks that have been coming in, all that's a whole nother hour conversation about like humanitarian aid and what is Gaza like. What is the challenge of Gaza to the way we provide humanitarian aid, and how really complicit in the horrific famine? It is now declared a famine in Gaza. How that happened? How did we allow that to happen from March 2nd to now? Which was a trajectory. A little bit.
I mean, it would be a shame not to talk about that as some. Give it a couple of minutes we are getting toward the end, but I want to know more about the logistics of feeding people, properly.
The UN had a good system, UNRWA, and from day one, Israel was on a mission to make UNRWA suspect to basically undo them. They had all kind of political motivations for, erasing the refugee problem, saying the Palestinians are no longer refugees. But the UN had systems in place. They weren't perfect, but they were reliable. They'd kept a population alive since 2006 when there have been sanctions. So the fact that those places were targeted, that UN schools were targeted, that UN, by missiles, etc., and then the whole international condemnation and, baseless accusations against UNRWA. So the UN still does have a system, and over 100 aid organizations, including AFSC, have been calling on the international community to let the aid in. That there are trucks available. There are supplies sitting at the borders. The borders need to be open. The routes need to be protected. And the people who are able to do that is the United Nations and their workers. And that has been so undermined by the U.S. and Israel by weaponizing aid, by putting up phony organizations like this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, just like outrageous things. And in the meantime, it's always been the plan of Israeli leaders to limit the amount of food and water and medicine available. And all the story as a war crime. That's just a war crime. Yeah.
No question. That is. But now with a war crime, like what can a viewer do to promote, to reverse this policy?
Pressure our governments to pressure Israel to live up to their international legal obligation to adequate food and medicine into a besieged population.
How are you going to pressure the U.S. government most effectively? Do you write to the White House? Do you write to your member of like
we have when the United States has supported other atrocities in Central America or East Timor or Vietnam or anywhere else? There were a combination of things: lobbying Congress, public protest, civil disobedience, raising boycotts. Educational forums, boycotts. Yeah, I mean, we have reversed horrific U.S. policies in the past. Supporting previous genocides like East Timor, like Guatemala in the early 80s, like Bangladesh in 1971. This is not the first genocide the U.S. has supported, but in each of those cases, U.S. civil society mobilized enough to change the policy, and that's what we need to do here.
Hooray for you. That is exactly what we need to. Listen, viewers. Do it. Let's do it some more. I have another show coming up in another few days with a person here in Canada, a woman who should be recognized, and we will be talking about how a lifelong Zionist has become what she calls a post-Zionist, and what she's doing on the street with a group of people called the Women in Black.
Nice.
I don't know whether Women in Black are meeting elsewhere or not, but that seems, I presume that's a revival of what was going on 20 years ago, something like that. At any rate, bless you both. You're doing wonderful work, and this is exactly the conversation I think we needed to have. Thank you, and you carry on, and I'll see you again soon, okay?
Thank you, Meta.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.